Welcome to our discussion on this gorgeous picture book. I love it so much. It's one of the favorites in my collection. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus by Chris Plehal. I never could pronounce that. Pictures by James Bernardin. And I'm sure you've probably heard of the story of Yes, Virginia, there was a Santa Claus. This is a picture book version of it. And again, it's another book I chose for two reasons. One, I love the color. I love the art. I love the way that they post her as an adorable redhead little Virginia. And I also know that there is so much history behind this story. Again, that can lead to teaching a child about this history and the origins of this wonderful story. And then allowing your child to interpret his or her beliefs about what the newspaper wrote back to Virginia about the spirit of Santa Claus. And maybe it can give your child a different view of Santa Claus beyond, this is sort of my Willy Wonka's, toy jackpot kind of a scenario. Okay, so, and it was her father, little Virginia, her father was I believe he was a coroner, and this was before the turn of the century, so 1895, 1898, something like that. Her father was a coroner, and his 8-year-old daughter asked him if there really is a Santa Claus. And he suggested she write to the Sun, a really reputable New York City newspaper at the time, assuring her, if you see it in the Sun, it must be so, is the famous line. And she actually did it. She wrote the letter to the Sun newspaper, and the Sun newspaper printed an answer for her. And this is based on a true story. And Virginia, when she became a woman, after her death in 1971, some old friends of hers formed their own little publishing company and published a children's book titled Yes, Virginia, or Yes, Virginia. I don't know if they added that there is a Santa Claus until at the end with the original book version. And this is, again, something you can do more historical research on with your child. But the modern, story that you see in the Norman Rockwell books, or that you see, they even made a couple of movie versions out of the story, have, of course, some tweaks to it. So if you want the absolute facts, you can do more, of course, research with your child. But this book gives a general idea of the story for some child who might not know the story already. And honestly, it is such a pretty book. It's so fun to look at. I love it more than I can say to you. Let's see if we can get this all the way in the camera for you. It's a big book. And I love how the art shows the characters kind of large and kind of unusual face shape. So there's a little realism, but not entirely realism to it. And you sort of get that Victorian era feel to it. Of course, this was not in England. This was in New York City. Christmas time is full of hope, joy, and happiness. My add to that is hope, usually. But 1 year long ago, Christmas wasn't very happy at all. Times were hard in New York City, and the weather was especially cold. People hurried through the streets, bundled up against the chill. No one stopped to smile or say hello. Christmas was just a few weeks away, but nobody seemed to notice. And if you've already gotten through the video, The Carpenter's Gift, this is another historical New York City Christmas origin tale that would have happened, about 40 years after this. So this was prior to 1900, and the origin of the Rockefeller Christmas tree was around 1931, 1933. Okay. Nobody, that is, except for a little girl named Virginia. Virginia loved Christmas. She loved the glittering lights. She loved the joyful carols. But most of all, she loved Santa Claus. She could hardly wait for Christmas Eve, when she would set out a plate of cookies and listen for sleigh bells. This year, she even made her very own Santa Claus book. Wow, Virginia's best friend Ollie exclaimed as he looked at the book. We should show Tom and Taylor and George. Come on, let's go. Virginia was a little bit nervous about showing it to everybody, but Ollie was already running down the stairs, so Virginia grabbed the book and followed him out the door. Isn't she cute? At the park, the other children gathered around to see Virginia's book. Everyone was excited. They all shouted all at once. Last year, Santa bought me a train set, said Tom. He bought me a dollhouse, exclaimed Taylor. I got a baseball mitt, shouted George. Did Santa bring you a baby bottle, too, said a voice. Charlotte, the meanest, bossiest, snootiest girl in town, pushed her way forward. You still believe in Santa? Charlotte scoffed. Ha! That's hysterical. No one could travel the whole world in one night. That's not true, said Virginia. Santa is as real as you are. It's baby stuff, teased Charlotte as she grabbed Virginia's Santa Claus book. With a laugh, she held it high above her head. Give it back, said Virginia. Stop it, shouted Ollie, rushing to help. But Ollie tripped and bumped into Virginia, who crashed into Charlotte, who lost her grip on Virginia's book, which landed in the mud with a splat. Charlotte laughed aloud. Face it, Virginia, she sneered. There is no Santa Claus. Virginia cradled the wet, muddy boots in her hands. She knew in her heart that Charlotte was wrong. There is a Santa Claus, she thought to herself, and I'm going to prove it. That afternoon, Virginia visited a place she knew was full of answers, the New York Public Library. Let's see, said Santa Claus. Let's see, Santa Claus, said the friendly librarian as she pulled book after book from the shelves. Ah, in England the name is Father Christmas. In Holland he's called Santa Claus, read Virginia. In Italy it's Babbo Natale, Ollie cried. According to this, said the librarian, flipping through a heavy book, he lives in Finland. No, wait, Greenland. And he's a giant goat, Ollie shouted. Virginia looked at the piles of books on the table. She was frustrated. This is all interesting, she said, but none of it tells me if Santa is real. And again, another opportunity lesson for learning here. The New York Public Library is an amazing piece of architecture. I've been there. It has a long history behind it. It's one of the most, iconic and biggest and most amazing libraries in the world. You can go with your child to the New York Public Library's website. They do have, you have to really get in there to find it, but they have a digital or virtual children's, they change it often. They have a virtual children's display of the children's section of the New York Public Library. You can even look at some slides of some really, really old vintage children's literature. You can look at photos of the children's section of the New York Public Library. You can look at the entire public library. They have I believe they even have a virtual walkthrough the last time I was on there. So that would be a fun kind of learning experiment to add to some curriculum after reading this book. That evening, Virginia passed through Herald Square in the heart of the city. A man with a beard and a red hat stood out on the street corner. Virginia's heart leaped, but the man was skinny and scraggly, and his beard was tied on with string. You're not Santa Claus, Virginia said. That's true. I'm not, replied the man. Then why are you dressed like him, Virginia said. I suppose you could say I work for him, said the scraggly Santa. I try to do whatever Santa would do if he were here. The old man jingled a rusty old bell. He was collecting money for the poor. Shouldn't you be wearing a coat? Asked Virginia. Well, I had one, replied the man, but someone needed it more than I did. So here again, we get into a beautiful lesson of giving to those that have less than we do, even if we ourselves have very little. That night, Virginia asked her father, is there really a Santa Claus? He began. Well, someone brought you presents last year, and someone ate the milk and cookies you left out. So, logically. But Virginia wasn't listening to her father's long-winded explanation. She was looking at something on her father's desk, a copy of the New York Sun. That's it, Virginia cried. I could write it to the newspaper. Well, yes, I suppose you could, said her father. After all, if you see it in the Sun, it is so. The very famous line there. Virginia went straight to her desk. She took out a pencil and paper, and she began to write a letter. Dear editor, she wrote, some of my little friends say there is no Santa Claus. Papa says if you see it in the Sun, it is so. Please tell me the truth. Is there a Santa Claus? Virginia smiled. She knew that when the Sun received her letter, the editor would surely give her the answer she needed. A few days later, Virginia's letter arrived at the new newspaper office. Santa Claus, growled Francis Church, editor of the Sun. This is preposterous. We report facts, not fantasies. I don't know, sir, said Lewis, Mr. Church's assistant. Maybe you should answer it. Lewis, people rely on this paper for the truth, said Mr. Church. We need to maintain our credibility. But she's only a child, Lewis pleaded. Everyone grows up sometime, Mr. Church said coldly. He tossed Virginia's letter down the garbage chute, which shut with a loud clang. Oops, I skipped a page here. Meanwhile, Virginia sat in her room and moped. She'd been waiting and waiting, but hadn't heard back from the newspaper. I just need some proof, Virginia sighed. Virginia, her mother said, believing in Santa isn't something you prove. It's something you do. Whenever you act like Santa Claus would and are kind to others, that proves he's real. Virginia thought about that, and then she remembered someone else who acted like Santa Claus. Suddenly, she had an idea. The next day, Virginia brought Scraggly Santa a Christmas present. "A new coat," he exclaimed. "Just what I needed." "Thank you, Virginia," said Virginia. "Well, Virginia, today you're Santa Claus." And even though Scraggly Santa was the one wearing the coat, Virginia felt warm inside. Isn't that beautiful? The message. And I love what her mother said. Santa isn't something you prove. It's something you do. So whenever you act like Santa and are kind to others, that proves he's real, which is the real nature and generosity of the spirit of St. Nicholas. Spirit and existence, should I say. "Isn't that adorable?" said a familiar voice. Virginia turned to see Charlotte standing nearby. On her face was a nasty smile, and in her hand a crumpled letter. "I found this outside the newspaper office," Charlotte said, "in a garbage can." Virginia felt a hole in the pit of her stomach. The newspaper had thrown her letter away. She couldn't believe it. With tears in her eyes, she ran away as fast as she could. That night, Scraggly Santa burst into Mr. Church's office. "This letter was written by a friend of mine," said Scraggly Santa. "I think you better answer it." "I'm sorry, but I only print the facts," said Mr. Church gruffly. "When people believe, they make the world a better place," he said. "Answer that letter and you'll give this girl, and maybe the whole city, something to believe in." Isn't that amazing? I love this book. Truly. That night, Mr. Church didn't go home. Long after everyone else was asleep, he sat in his office thinking about what Scraggly Santa had said. "If you see it in the sun," he mumbled, "it's so." Virginia wasn't sleeping either. She felt like everything she loved, presents, Christmas, Santa Claus, didn't matter anymore. "Baby stuff," she sniffed sadly. Oops, did I miss? Yes, I did. I'm missing lots of pages. The next morning at breakfast, Virginia stared at her porridge. She didn't feel like eating. She didn't feel like doing anything. Let me make sure you can see this well. Virginia's parents were worried. They had never seen their daughter so upset. Then there was a knock at the door. "Look!" shouted Ollie as he held a newspaper. Virginia gasped as she read the headline. She couldn't believe her eyes. In the paper was an editorial, a message written just for her. "Virginia, your little friends are wrong. They do not believe except for what they can see. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. He exists as certainly as love and generosity and devotion exist. How dreary would the world be if there was no Santa Claus? It would be as dreary as if there was no Virginias." And this, of course, that was a real line from the original article. Obviously, it's cut a little bit here, but there would be no childlike faith then, no poetry, no romance. The eternal light with which childhood fills the world would be extinguished. No Santa Claus? Thank God he lives, and he lives forever. 1,000 years from now, Virginia, nay, 10 times, 10,000 years from now, he will continue to make glad the heart of childhood. And here we have the page boy selling the newspaper to everyone who passes by. I love this scene with the train above ground, kind of a Christmas train with red bows on it, the clock tower, hanging the bows on the clock tower at the train station, the tree, the candy canes, and here's the sun. Is there a Santa Claus? I love the art in this book. I think they did a very nice job. Virginia had never been so happy. There was a magical feeling inside her bursting to get out. "Merry Christmas," she shouted to the street below. "Merry Christmas," replied an old man who was passing by. He had rosy cheeks, a snowy white beard, and a twinkle in his eye. The old man reached into his coat and handed something to Virginia. It was her Santa Claus book, good as new. With the tip of his hat, the old man continued on his way, and Virginia smiled as she watched him go. And as she stood on the step, book in hand, Virginia thought the whole world seemed to glow a little bit brighter. I love this scene too, how the front of their house is decorated, sort of the costume from the time, pre-1900, the Santa look. And here, of course, we have the first page of the Sun article. Is there a Santa Claus? And here it is. "I am 8 years old. Some of my little friends say there is no Santa Claus. Papa says if you see it in the sun, it is so. Please tell me the truth. Is there a Santa Claus?" And I'm not going to read you the article here, but you can even look it up online. But if you purchase this book, you can read this to your child at the end. You could even read it to your child ahead of time. I think they'll be more interested in hearing this read to them, or reading it themselves if they've read the rest of the book first. And I'm not even sure. Seems like one of the original book I have of the story, and also seeing it in some of the Norman Rockwell Christmas books I have, it's longer than this, so I don't know if this is all of it or not. Can't remember. I'd have to look at one of the others to compare. But that is it for this book, and it is such an incredible book. Beautiful picture book. And, you know, you can get into more of the history of the Sun newspaper and journalism pre-1900, how newspapers were even printed pre-1900, which in itself I find really fascinating. There is a movie version of this that has the oldest son, John Boy, who was in the original Waltons series. If you ever grew up on the Waltons, he plays the father, I believe. And that was on Amazon Prime. I watched it a year ago. And so, I mean, this book, you can just make it be about the story and teaching your child the origins of this as a famous sort of Christmas tale. And really what I find, honestly, the most potential for, let's go back to this, for learning with your child is discussions about what they say in the letter. You know, one of my favorite parts, not believe in Santa Claus, you might as well not believe in fairies. You might get your papa to hire men to watch in all the chimneys on Christmas Eve to catch Santa Claus. But even if they did not see Santa Claus coming down, what would that prove? Nobody sees Santa Claus, but that is no sign that there is no Santa Claus. The most real things in the world are those neither children nor men can see. Did you ever see fairies dancing on the lawn? Of course not, but that's no proof that they're not there. Nobody can conceive or imagine all the wonders there are unseen in the world. And so whoever wrote this article is just a brilliant writer and had a wonderful Christmas spirit. And I'm so grateful that this was something that has stayed in our culture and holiday historical history, because it's such an amazing read, especially when you read the entire thing. But talking to your child about faith versus fact, is believing or is believing seeing, and whether or not your child still believes in Santa Claus or not, and if not, what is the meaning of Santa Claus beyond just the gifts? Santa Claus is symbolic in now American holiday Christmas traditions, and it's not just about the presents. So bringing in a lot of that history and what you want your child to take away from this would be entirely up to you, but you can go a lot of different routes. So anyway, another one of my parent professional approved holiday picture books for children. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus.